Hi, everybody. I'll try to keep it a little lively because I know I'm very close, this kind of day is winding down and all of that. And if you'll forgive me, I have a couple of remarks, so I want to reference them and make sure I have them, so I have my little leather-bound book. First of all, thank you to the Mellon Foundation for organizing what's happening today, for making it happen, to Kelly Brown for organizing it, to the UC Humanities Network for making it happen as well, and for existing, and for all of you for being here today. So thank you very much, especially, well, everyone made time in their day, but many of you traveled, I know, to get here, so thank you very much for that. I'm here to talk about a document that's a tiny little thing in your life, and one of the most critical. So I often am looking at people who've been working for 15 to 25 years, figuring out who they are now, who they've become, where they want to go, and then packaging them in a way that makes sense. So I'm basically a career change guy, career shift guy, helping people sort of walk through that and what that might look like. Today we get to talk about sort of maybe the early part of your career, and maybe some of this will carry on with you for the rest of it. But if you're looking at shifting outside a traditional academic track, how to take a CV that you've been maybe trained to write and converting that to a resume, because the resume is really complex and it's going to have a lot of different audiences and a lot of expectations, so a lot of weight is put on those. So I should tell you a little bit about my practice. I call myself a ghost. Casper. No, I don't know. But really, sort of, I'm a ghost because people hire me to do a stealth job search. Everybody almost that I work for is pretty senior in their life, in their career, and they don't want people to know that they're looking for something new. If they're at the C level, it may take them 2 or 3 years before they actually ever move. Because of that, things like LinkedIn, which I champion and I speak on for hours and hours and hours, when someone initially comes to me and says, hey, I'd love to connect, I always email them and say, but wait, my title is Executive Resume Writer, and by the way, that's going to get blasted out to all your contacts and potentially out you. So I really, as I sort of said, I am a ghost. So what I'm sharing today is sort of with that lens in mind. I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I started, well, in 1984, I was 14. I went to the bookstore. I found this book called Resumes That Knock 'Em Dead, and it apparently was the very first one that ever was issued. For some reason, I bought it, and I thought it was the greatest thing ever. I also had a paper route, and I tied flies and sold them to the fly shop, and had a little photography studio, and all sorts of weird things. So I thought, I don't know, I was just sort of always, and so what I did is I started, instead of maybe playing with dolls or whatever, I started writing fake resumes on my typewriter. So I've been doing this for a really long time. So of course, then went to school. Then when I was sort of out of, getting ready to leave school myself, my resume was pretty bomb dig at that point. Although not now when I look at it, but that was many years ago, 16 or so. And friends were like, hey, could you write mine? Could you write mine? And then, word spread, and I started charging money. And so then I moved to New York to pursue my, I was, by the way, a music teacher. I've been a music teacher since I was 16, because in the arts you start teaching piano very young, much like dance. And so I'd been teaching for a long time. So I went to New York to pursue my dream, landed in, in a consulting firm, of course. And she said, because you have founded your own performing arts company for kids, we had 140, I think, from 9 counties at one point. She said, and because you can write, and I found out later I couldn't write for business, so I had 6 months of bloody nightmare getting sort of, retrained how to write for business. Anyway, she said, why don't you come and ghostwrite for us, because we we sort of write grant proposals for clients, and it was the nonprofit sector and what have you. And then along comes executive search. She says, I think you have good judgment. This is the partner I worked for. So why don't you go ahead and take this thing called executive search? And I said, sure. And it wasn't true entire executive search, but I learned a lot about it. And when I moved to San Francisco, I was like, do I want to go back to the nonprofit sector? Do I want to do arts? And meanwhile, I'm writing these resumes in the evening for all these people. Or do I want to stay in executive search? I decided to stay in executive search, and I did retained executive search in the corporate world for about 1 year, about actually 13 months. As it turns out, I was much more interested in their shoes than in what, the client was doing. And I was also much more interested in the candidate, because I was always working with the candidate side anyway. And so I thought, all right, well, I should launch. But there was a failure to launch because I thought, oh, I'm just going to go back to the arts one more time. So I went back and I worked as a program director for the San Francisco Boys Chorus all the time, having these, conversations with clients. Sarah, on the side. Okay, yeah, we'll meet tonight. And then writing resumes, about 40 a year. Finally, in 2008, I said, okay, I've had it. I'm going to do this full time. And I let all my clients know that I'd worked for, all of them who had sort of, progressed along in their career as well. And I had 22 people lined up within the first week of launching my business in 2008. So I've had a business for a very long time, but went totally official in 2008. And I should also share with you, and maybe this is a little too long, I still teach piano. Have a couple kids who are outstanding and ready to go to a DMA. So our purpose today is a crash course in basically trying to convert or organize what you bring to the table for an audience that's going to expect something different than an academic CV. We don't have typewriters obviously anymore, and back in the day we used to type it up, print it out, send out 100 copies and see what stuck. Well, that doesn't work today. In fact, the expectation is that it's going to just be a hole-in-one. The expectation is, hey, this is going to be the most customized, perfect fit ever on the face of the earth, and if you're not, don't worry about it. We're not going to look at this person. So how do you not only face that, but also translate what you've got to offer? There's also what's called applicant tracking systems, or ATS for short. If you're not familiar with that, basically, when you send your resume into, like, if something says, attach your resume here online and send it off, it's going to be parsed and pulled apart, and if the keywords and what have you aren't in the right spot, sounds like a lot of you know it already, then you're not even going to show up for a human being. By the way, which is why 80% of your job search should totally be networking, and I loved what was said before. Totally loved what was said before. Oh, as a little segue before I forget, the question I think was, if your email goes into a black hole, and I love the idea of sort of following up a little bit later and saying, hey, by the way, but another tool is to use LinkedIn, because LinkedIn is still somewhat novel, especially for people outside of tech. And so if you reach out to someone through LinkedIn, they may actually get it and sort of respond to you more quickly that way. All right, have I gotten everything? Okay, so I think the biggest thing for you to take away also is that you are your own advocate. There is nobody who's going to write this document for you, and yet it is the most important thing. Let me grab the clicker. All right. So the very first thing I like to talk to people about when they come to me is, everybody likes to start with the design. Wow, that's really pretty. I really like that. I'm going to squeeze my stuff into that. Well, that's problematic, obviously. And if you think about it for 1 second, it makes sense. But even when you look at it, you just sort of fall in love with this design. You're like, man, I'm going to make it work. Let's rewind a little bit and start with, then of course we start writing content. Let's start with your purpose. What is your purpose? So whenever I start working with people, what is the purpose? If you don't have that in mind, you can't go anywhere. And I loved that purpose was also mentioned when you're sort of reaching out to people. What's the purpose of it? I always like to say, ask for 10 minutes of their time, and if they like you, they'll keep you around for a little bit longer. So it seems like a little less of a commitment to them. The purpose informs the content of your document, which then is going to inform the design. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Just tuck that away. There are some technical differences between a CV and a resume. A CV, I just wrote for a very, very senior person at a university, and all my clients are worldwide, so they're not necessarily here or associated with UC, but his was a 37-page CV, which I got down to 29 pages, and it was an expected 2-page cover letter. So, that gives you a sense of sort of the scope of what a CV can eventually be. And we didn't have an ounce of fluff in it, I have to add. The style is sort of exhaustive lists, to the point I just mentioned. The users are almost always restricted to academics, doctors, and research. By the way, I'll make this available to you afterward. I love that you're typing away and all that business. Totally, please do. But I'm going to make it available as a download. Which, by the way, it was really funny because some of you, the moment it came out, like 3 or 4 dribbled in little downloads because it notifies me when it's downloaded. Yesterday, today, I mean, it was like, really? All right, overachievers. Okay, so your audience is gatekeepers, sort of people that are. It's pretty gracious, I have to say, a lot of times. If there's a search firm involved for the guy I was talking about, you know, it's not so gracious. But if you're the right fit, it's very gracious because they're going to make a ton of money off of you. But the audience is much more friendly. You have a lot of subject matter experts who are going to be vetting and looking at your resume before you ever talk to them. This is, again, excuse me, the CV. The content, we're going to talk a bit more about this later, but of course, education, experience lists. If you think about categorized lists, you've got sort of buckets that you're going to dump everything in. And when I'm talking to people about how to organize their information, I say, let's think of them as buckets. We're just going to toss it in, and we're not going to worry about the details until we have our buckets right, basically. And then finally, there's a lot of sort of intellectual authority that you're bringing at this point. So that's certainly going to be there. A resume is usually 1 to 2 pages long. The rule of thumb here, so someone just snapped their head up like, what? Yeah, so the rule of thumb is if you have 8 to 10 years of experience, 1 page. If you have more than that, and you have substantive information, go ahead and fill the entire 2 pages. Once you get into a more senior role, typically SVP or a, you know, in the C-suite, if that's where you're going, you can go ahead and build it out to 3 or 4 pages. So there's a lot to pack in there. I've got a solution toward the end that will help you, I think, give you a little bit of a break on that 1-page thing. You have to give targeted examples. You're not going to give a laundry list, right? Actually, let me back up. You're going to give targeted examples of what you offer, right? You're not going to just say, oh, I'm really good at this when it doesn't relate to the audience. Users is everyone else besides those 3 sets over there on the left, right? At least in the US. Audience, the gatekeepers could include that ATS, that applicant tracking system that I was talking about. By the way, look up ASCII conversion, A-S-C-I-I, when you have a chance, because it's all about converting your beautiful resume into a document that is just a text-only document. It helps you sort of clean it up, because if you just convert Word into ASCII, it turns into a piece of, it doesn't look very good. And so you can sort of clean it up, and it gives you all the rules for that. One of the things is convert it, name it, shut it, reopen it, and then on the, I'm getting too far into the weeds, but we're going to get in the weeds in a minute, so I might as well go on. What will happen is it's going to give you no write margin when you convert it, save it, close it, and reopen it. It creates no write margin, which means that that write margin will wrap to whatever the destination box is properly, and the printer. And then lots of subject matter experts. Now, the gatekeepers could include also an assistant. Or, and they might have like 500 resumes that made it through the applicant tracking system. So they're going to be sorting. People sometimes say, especially with advanced degrees, oh, I feel like I shouldn't put it behind my name. Yes, you should, because the assistant may still be looking at the tops of those 500 resumes. And if it doesn't have an advanced degree behind it, then you might be out just because of that. And then content. Executive summary, you've probably heard a lot about that. It's similar to that elevator pitch that you heard, and you've probably heard a million times. Executive summaries can be entirely boring, and if you look at executive summaries samples online, it may look interesting to you, but to folks who've been in this world for a long time, they just are like, really? You're just copying from someone else's and putting it over there. So if we have a chance later, I think I'm going to touch on that a little bit as well. The executive summary should really summarize who you are at a really interesting level. Experience section. The experience section is where we're going to focus today. We've got scope of work. Scope of work is like a little paragraph that narrates, it kind of tells the story, includes lots of little keywords. And then the bullet points. A lot of times when you see a bullet point, or rather when you see a resume done by folks who, you know, I have people say, oh my God, my resume is so bloated, I've been doing it for 25 years and it's, you know, since I was in college, and I'm just adding things to it. And yeah, what it looks like is, we call it a polka dot resume because it's got bullet, blah, 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 and all sorts of, I did this, I did that, I poured some water, I blah, 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 all these things that are really inconsequential. And really what you're looking for is, all right, what are the outcomes of the work I did? Why are they going to want to hire me? Because they're going to want to see an example of outcomes that I bring to the table. So we're going to spend a lot of time on that, the bullets. Because one of the challenges you have when you're coming out of school straight away is that you have a lot of stuff you've done, but it's hard to say, and I saved $1 billion. You know, that's really, really hard to say. So how do you use quantitative, how can you throw in quantitative detail when you don't have it? So we're going to talk a lot about that. And then both of these documents are self-marketing documents. They're just presented differently. And then also, if it's going overseas, it's slightly different. And you know, if you're going overseas, we can talk later, I guess, because you really have to look and see, what does Australia require? What does France require? All right, here's an example CV. I just pulled this down. It's a law CV, you'll see. And I just pulled this down because it was public and available and quick for me to put on. You'll see that we've got the header, education, honors and awards. You recognize this, no doubt. Research experience, academic positions, publications, presentations, relevant experience. Next, this is this continuation. Other experience, professional associations and memberships, languages, activities. Raise your hand if that looks familiar in terms of, okay, good. So I'm talking to the right audience, good. So here is that same resume somebody converted. I should say the same CV that someone converted to a resume and said, here's the example. Look at those 3 categories. Clearly, we're not going to, any of us are going to be going to the bar, necessarily, or having bar admissions, but education, experience, and bar admissions. All the rest of that stuff disappeared. Which makes you want to cry. I mean, really, you're like, really, I did all of this and it's for naught? There are buckets on LinkedIn, by the way, where you can put some of those lists. You know, patents is one of them, projects is another. LinkedIn interviewed me a couple years ago and I was like, there needs to be a place for projects. And sure enough, when they did their thing, I was like, oh, I think I influenced that a little bit, which felt pretty good. So that makes sense. Now let's look at these side-by-side sort of comparisons. Here are all those categories that we saw on the CV, right? And just to illustrate that point, we have a lot fewer buckets, and so we have to basically create buckets, which we're going to talk about soon. All right. So what we've seen is helpful, but what if we borrowed some principles from a career change resume? Oh my God, I'm hungry. Okay, so I always talked about, pardon me, I always talk about your career. Let's pretend like you've been in your career for 17 years. Your career, or the body of work, is a blueberry pie, and you have 8 pieces, but you find out that whoever you're, you know, sort of where you're wanting to go only wants 4 of those pieces. Well, by God, my ego says, I want to show you all 8. But they say, I'm going to die if I have to eat all 8 pieces. I only want to have 4. So basically, your resume, unlike a CV, should be the intersection between what you have done and what you bring to the table in all your glory, and what they want. So that's a huge principle that even if you only walk away with that today, you will have won. You'll have won the internet, I don't know. Okay, this is not a career change resume, and I'll show you why. This is a pilot. It was very fun to write, and then I got a whole bunch of pilots I was writing for with this guy. This is fictionalized, of course. His name was not Matthew Smith. But you'll notice, I have a little pointer, that key accomplishments right there, those bullet points are just straight up, totally to, he wants to go fly for JetBlue. You know, it will totally make sense to JetBlue. He's not doing a career change. What I wrote here, the bullet points give examples and outcomes of the work, but they are not categorized, right? Because we don't have to encourage the reader to see those specific slices of the pie. Now let's look at a career change resume. This is something that I think I invented. I'm trying to remember, because I think I did, but I've done it so much and people have started adopting it. It's been printed in books and all that stuff. But what you'll notice is that at the beginning of each of those bullets, we have categories, right? Those categories also serve as keywords and phrases. for the applicant tracking system. So it serves the purpose of getting through that darn computer that's been programmed, by the way, based off of the job description. So if something says business development and something else says revenue development, go ahead and switch those around, just tweak them, because you've got to get through that applicant tracking system. But also when you sit down to read it, you as the reader, it's duh, that person brings these things to the table, right? I mean, it totally makes sense. So, oops, let me go back. So these are the hallmark, basically, sort of categorized bullets of the career change resume, and that's where we're going to focus. Now, I have to give a caveat here because we're not inventing fiction, and we're also not stretching the truth. So let's talk about, for a moment, sort of what is fixed data, stuff you can't change, right, on the resume. Obviously, unless you're married or getting married, you can't change your name. Your contact information is pretty static. Company names, unless they've changed, in which case, look up some examples and see, because sometimes if they've been acquired or if there's been some sort of change in the name, it's helpful to put them both, just because people might recognize and say, oh, I knew Sally from blah, blah, blah. Job titles, those cannot change. By the way, I have a tip on job titles. Sometimes you have one job title at the company and that's all you have. Great. What you'll do is you'll put the job title there, you put the date out here, let's say it's 2009 to present, and you've been this job title the whole time. Great. What if you've had 2 or more? So here's the way to handle that. What you'll do is you'll put them on 1 line, 2 line, 3 lines. By the way, that 2009 to 2011 is over here to the right. As long as it's exposed to where people can see, okay, they've been there for that many number of years. I think I said to 11, but I meant to present. Then you put in parentheses the month and the year, to the month and the year, right behind the job title, each of those job titles. What that does is it shows, first of all, it gives you more keywords. It also shows that you were trusted enough to be promoted. And if there's a demotion, by the way, don't put, only put the most recent one, because they're going to say, why did you go from a director to a manager, and then you have a whole big bag of worms to deal with. So, just distract from that, but you're not to that point yet, I'm sure. So, my website, by the way, has a bunch of examples. If you go to the homepage and click on the right, actually click on the word samples, and you'll see a whole bunch of stuff, and feel free to borrow liberally from those concepts. And then finally, of course, the education. People always say, does the education go on the top or the bottom? Does anybody know the answer? Basically, if you are using the education to make the pitch, it goes on the top. So typically that's between 0 and 2 years. At that point, you're then going to have enough career experience to where you can go ahead and put the education toward the bottom, and it's expected at that point. So the example we have, by the way, today is at the top. The flexible content you have, to your discretion, is professional headline. So back in the day, I don't know if you've seen these, but, well, actually, the examples we had earlier, it starts right there with education at the top, right? There's nothing that really says anything about who you are. In fact, the name, as I recall, was completely missing. But these days, we'll start with a professional headline. For me, it would be executive resume writer. It could be senior executive resume writer, but I'm not really interested in that word, the senior part. So the professional headline when you're doing a career change is, wow, now how do I straddle both sides of the fence here? How do I make that into one title? It could be that you're sort of showing both sides of what you do. There also may be, by the way, a subheadline, and the subheadline might show industries where areas of practice, industries that you work with, if it's no more than 3. If I'm working right now with a PhD in neurology, and she's a medical writer, and she has the areas of, her therapeutic areas are 17, but she really likes 3. And so what we've done is we've put as a sub-headline that she's a senior something medical writer and something designer, I forget exactly at the moment, but right under that we say the 3 therapeutic areas where she's focused. And then in the executive summary we say, refer to the list later in the resume, which I'll tell you about. Okay, executive summary is very, very high level. It usually says sort of your style, who you are, how many years of career experience you have altogether. Sometimes you can segment it out and say, let's say we have, and you're going to see action in a minute, 10 years experience, including 3 years in teaching in an academic setting and 7 years in a program management role, or whatever. You can divide those out because you're really at that point where, probably a lot of you are at that point where you have diverse things you can bring to the table. Make sure you sort of summarize it and then say, and this is how it's broken out. By the way, is this feedback bothering anyone? Okay. Scope of work paragraphs, which we talked about, and then bullet points. Okay, but how to begin? Let's move on. Start with some warm-up questions. And I wrote, this will take some time, but you took this far to get to where you are. But remember, this is a dinky little document that means a whole ton. Someone spoke to me before and said, I think I might have misunderstood the exercise, because there's skills and then there's things that describe me, like organized. And I'm like, yeah, but you didn't lose. You actually have isolated that stuff. Now go extract the skills. So she did the exercise beforehand. Basically, that takes a good bit of time, right? And then some of the stuff we're going to do today takes a good bit of time. As a rule of thumb, people I work with, typically the projects are 6 to 8 hours with me working with them, to all the way up for people who that senior university person I was telling you about, his was 16 hours over the course of several weeks. So, and by the way, that's time with me. That's not time he spent working. So just to give you an idea, don't shortcut it. Oop, did I do everything? Okay, so here are some questions to ask. Who are you and what part of you matters? Let me just get out with the hardest question of all, right? So put that as sort of the purpose of this exercise, right? Don't just say it, but see if you can prove it through numbers. Talk about, if you've talk about class sizes. Talk about the range of the class sizes. If you have taught, again, talk about the number of lecture courses versus the number of lab courses that you've taught. By the way, we're creeping into some of those ways of quantifying your information when it's not a traditional outcome, by the way. And then what will add focus or niche to the document. And keep these as sort of really guiding principles as you go. What's your intention? Or your why? There's a really great book called Start With Why by Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K. He has a TEDx talk called How Great Leaders Inspire Action, I think it is. And he's talking about sort of, Martin Luther King said, I have a dream, not I have a plan. So Martin Luther King was talking to that sort of inner person that you can't help but listen when he speaks. And he says everything you do, that's just one example, is starting with why. Martin Luther King was starting with why when he said that. So when you sort of do this, it's extra hard work, but it's super important. What do you want to highlight? What do you want to de-emphasize? And here's something that's really interesting. Why have you been attractive to past employers? That may be hard skills, soft skills. It doesn't matter at that point. So standard data that's typically wanted in a resume is your work history, the years of experience, what you can do, some of the unique data, and this is not probably something that you're going to have a lot of yet, but tuck it away in the back of your head, is the size of budgets you've managed, if you bring in any income, and then also if you've managed any teams. The teams, by the way, don't have to be formal direct reports. They can be direct, they can be indirect reports, meaning you give them their reviews, or it can be interns you've managed. It can be what's called functional reports. So if you have teams and someone else shares that team, those are obviously functional reports. So let's carry on. So you're still going to be unsure, so we're going to start eliminating the guesswork with findings from the job description analysis. And if you were one of those folks who downloaded this today, you might recognize what this looks like, but might not have had a chance to go through it yet. And it's totally all right. So when you look at, let me try to see if I can explain it briefly. Basically, let's say you have let's say you have one career target, and it's a change of some sort. You're going to look and see what's out there and available online. Indeed.com is an example of a place where you can go, because Indeed aggregates postings, and then you can fly out and go look at the actual website where it's from. And say, let me collect 3 or if you're really sort of aggressive, 5. 3 to 5 job descriptions that are on this track that I'm thinking about going. Then you're going to take the exercise that you already have, start to follow the instructions, plug it in, and you're going to start saying, so here we have a nonprofit administrator, an executive director, a community advocate. You have the organization's name, and then those X's start to get built as you sort of see program development. Okay, so one of those has program development. Program management. Okay, so I'm not going to be developing programs as a nonprofit administrator, but I am going to be managing them here. And so you start to see a story, right? Community, planning, and partnerships, 2 of those jobs. Now that isn't to say that you have to say, whoops, 2 of those jobs don't have that, so I can't mention it. What this is just an exercise, remember, to sort of shake loose what we're trying to find. The rest of it makes sense, I'm sure. And then finally, you can say, okay, how can I combine these into categories? Our findings are, let's put program development and management in the same bucket, because we can probably tell that story. Community partnerships. Well, here they ask for planning and partnerships, right? But maybe you don't have experience in planning. So just skip it. Go ahead and put community partnerships and talk about your work there. Facilities and operations, we've combined those 2, numbers, rows 9 and 10, because they're very similar in terms of sort of how the approach. Advocacy and communications. Those 2 things go really nicely hand in hand, and you can see where they were sort of bunched up from 11 and 12, and then finally event development and management. So those are the buckets we're going to run with. All right, now step 2, voila, you're going to do some free-form sketching. And the big thing is you have to give yourself a break. You've identified these categories, now you just need to go in and almost begin journaling. And it may be that you need to, I'm just going to check the clock, see how I'm doing on time. Okay. I better pick up the pace a little more. So basically don't get hung up on what to include. Just write about it. And if you put too many rules on yourself right away, it tends to sort of shut off creativity. And that is the last thing you need at this point. You need all the creativity you can get. Are there questions at this point? Yes?
What if the numbers that you have are extremely unimpressive? So sometimes like teaching in the humanities, you'll have taught this amazing course for 4 students. Do you put that on the resume?
That's a super question. I feel like Oprah. I know, right? And you got a car! Okay, so that's a really good question. The question is, what if it's not yet impressive? Well, that is when you wouldn't want to focus on the size of the class, but perhaps the number of activities that happen in that class. So you can say, taught a class for a graduate course. Oh, actually, this sample is coming later, but were there other classes possibly involved too?
No.
Okay. This is why I get paid the big bucks, just to walk around the world and think about these things. That's a really good question, and I would not put that number in. If you have a range like class sizes of 4 to 12 or 4 to 30, definitely. Now, if you've taught outside of that, like maybe you have at some community program or something taught larger classes. Yes, this is the answer. Okay, so what you'll do is you'll take and you'll combine all of that together. Yeah, because you have spoken in front of groups of probably larger groups, right? You just have to find a way to write that. There was another question. Yes?
I can just speak very loudly.
Okay.
Okay, so I love your idea about the buckets. And when I was filling out that spreadsheet, my biggest problem was... I was. And my biggest problem was like, well, but this is different from that thing. And I just ended up with so many skills and functions, and my X's didn't really do that much for me.
Okay. So that's a really, really tough question. So were you looking at skills? Specifically, they were skills?
Yeah, some were desired skills,
Yeah.
and then some were like, you will be performing these functions.
Right. So I would put them, first of all, I would take them outside of the spreadsheet, which can be a little daunting, because this happened to me yesterday. And I said, okay, I'm going to And I color code sometimes when I get like 50 lines of what people have given back to me, and I say, okay, first of all, that whole do you have the experience or don't you have the experience is really helpful, because you can start saying red is no, green is go. Once that's sort of identified, you can say, well, I don't yet have these skills, so I can't really authentically do them, so cut those out. Then start to categorize them and say, all right, for instance, advocacy and communications. Those things could go together. Start to see what you can begin to blend or combine, because it's probably going to help you to tell the story even better if you're blending and combining anyway. The other thing is you would end up, if you didn't start to combine them with a little ampersand, you would have like a polka dot resume. So it's not easy. I actually need to mention that if you have another career target that you're going for as well, you can do a whole other separate job description analysis and then find out what the common themes are between both of those. Good. Oh, good.
The list was so extensive.
Yeah, I would be so curious to see that actually. Yeah, yes.
You mentioned hard skills versus soft skills.
Right.
Could you give an example?
Yeah, so a lot of times a hard skill would be event planning. A soft skill would be I'm organized. A soft skill would be I'm dedicated. I'm committed to the insane asylum. No. So really, those things are people who write job descriptions usually rip them off from someone else and say that sounds good, that sounds good, that sounds good, that sounds good, and then when the recruiter gets it, they're like, yes, you better be dedicated, you better be committed, and you better be so fabulous, I want to hire you. Why would you say that? That's ridiculous. Stop. Tell me something that matters. So it's really, really hard to know, and I guess from my point of view, someone comes along and they're like, I'm committed, and I say, great. Well, you're a senior vice president of blah. You had better be committed. So those sorts of things, if they're soft like that, put them aside. Focus on the hard skills, things you actually do and lead. Any other questions? We have a lot more to go. Okay, good. So the assessment of that free-form sketching. All right. Oh, this might be helpful. Maybe, I don't know. Is your experience around each category balanced, or is it heavy in certain areas? Okay, if it's balanced, you can use this is our same example from earlier, right? You'll notice we have basically sort of an even distribution of information for every single one of the buckets. Oh, I got fancy. Oh, pardon me. Here we go. Go? Okay. Here is if it is heavy in certain areas. So what we've done is you actually may end up with only 2 of these and say, man, I am the fundraising thing, I'm gangbusters, and that's where I'm going to focus it. And then program highlights, for days. And by the way, the rule of thumb is once you have one of these categories, don't put more than 5 bullets underneath. This, by the way, also serves the purpose of breaking it up for the reader. Obviously, it also gives you keywords for both the applicant tracking system and for the human reader. And then this particular sort of role, it's an executive director, marketing and PR often sort of falls there as well, so that's a nice way to do it. But give yourself 2 main categories and see if you can elevate it. See if you can elevate it. That's if it's heavy in certain areas. Okay. Now we're going to write and we're going to organize. So this is where it gets really into the weeds and crunchy. So this is what I spend all day long doing. I hope it make it interesting. What was the activity? How long did it take to complete? What's interesting about that is, let's say you're planning an event and you have a 3-month ramp up, right? And then were there project phases? This is another way to I didn't just say that. Another way to create some quantitative outcomes, right? I do this a lot for people in tech. Probably about 85 to 90% of my business now is tech, even though in 06 was when I first wrote one. But lots and lots of referrals because apparently I do a bang-up job. But basically, people who are developing product, they're always looking at a project lifecycle. And a lot of what I do as a teacher, which I have a few students, and I've taught a lot in the past, is really similar. There's a logical beginning, and a logical middle, and a logical end. And so those are some really great questions. And by the way, don't write yet. You're just asking yourself questions and jotting ideas. What were the essential components? sort of the steps and the things involved. What was your role? Okay, this is important because people say, well, I haven't ever led a team yet. Well, you may have led a team, you just don't realize it. You need to think about, have you led a part of the team? If it was an assignment in school, were you part of a 5-member team that did X, Y, and Z? Then say part of a 5-member team, leading the blah, blah, blah part of that, if that makes sense. So, were you a contributor? Were you an influencer? There are a lot of people in the professional world who, especially the closer they get to the C-suite, the more they have to have the power of influence. And so that's something that you can, sort of borrow and use, because also when you're in the beginning of your career, you also have to influence a lot, because you can't just point and say do. How big was the team? So part of a 5-member team who managed an event, or created or built and blah, 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 an event at which 200 people attended. There are some more of those outcomes and metrics to talk about. Does that help sort of get the juices flowing on outcomes? Who was involved or impacted? Where were they geographically? Oh, that's another thing. Where were they geographically? People are like, well, I'm here in Berkeley all the time. And yet, I worked with a group in India, virtually. I worked with a group in London, and someone else in South Africa. Well, that's actually really interesting, because that's a skill set that not everybody brings to the table. If you traveled, put that in there, because not everybody has not even everybody has their passport. Certainly don't have it stamped. So those are really interesting sort of things that begin to differentiate. What kind of budget was involved? If it's a small budget, you have to sort of think about the organization where it's going. So, for instance, the San Francisco Boys Chorus, I want to say, had a budget of $600,000. So the people I write for at, like, the Fortune 1 have massive budgets. So what that does, if you look at that, it begins to tell a story. And if you have authentically managed, managed a $5,000 budget, they're not going to ever place you in front of a $500,000 budget or $1 million budget. So go ahead and own it. Say, this is what I have experience doing, and they're going to recognize it and say, hey, I think they can take this next step, especially with some guidance and some leadership. Budget management and team management, those are really, really quite big when you go into even administration. And then what was the final outcome? What was the end result of what you did? Now, depending on how you decide to write it, and so I go off of instinct sometimes when I'm writing this stuff, and I'm like, what's going to be most important, the end result? Because sometimes we'll say, I did X, Y, and Z, and that accomplished that. What that does is it puts the accomplishment at the end, so you'll just flip that and say, I did X, Y, and Z by doing blah, 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 blah. So you just flip the order in which it comes. It's a little harder in this case. And so you can put the outcome at the end. You can maybe italicize it. 200 people attended, and we made $1 billion that day. Whatever that might be. Okay, here is a copy example. I'm going to just stop and let you read. So this is an example of sort of the first one, tour and concert management, is direct, because you're going to be managing tours and concerts. The next one is euphemized. If I don't want to go that way, if I want to go into some other thing and be perceived. So go ahead and read that for a moment. You can probably see all the things we've already talked about and where they're showing up. My hope in creating these was to give you something that you can download later and look at it and say, how can I plug my stuff into that format, basically. So remember that we got this tour and concert management. That was from the job description analysis. And then we realized, it's actually not for anything that's arts related. So I'm going to strip that out, and instead of calling them singers, I'm going to call them participants. And then I'm going to focus on sort of the 5-member team and the planning it, rather than presenting it, because that's not as important to that euphemized audience. Next, we have, let's say that you did tour and concert management for 3 years. How do you say that? This is now the same idea presented in the aggregate. So I'll be quiet and let you read these two. So you can see here that our 30 media appearances per year is now, over those 3 years, 150 plus media appearances. Our, where is it? Our 18 major concerts per year are now 90 major concerts. And so that's how we're presenting it in the aggregate in a super quick bullet point that says it all. Because, by the way, this is a marketing document, it's not a tome. Right? So, there's that. Here's another example, I hope, and I think this is pretty straightforward. Teaching and student development. Let me just have you read that. So you'll see there at the end I said, see the resume addendum for course names. I'm going to show you that in just a minute. The resume addendum is a way to get away with that one-pager because you're feeling restricted with a one-page resume. You're like, but I have so much more to offer the world. Create a resume addendum. Give it the same masthead, by the way, as your resume, and it looks like you've sort of obeyed the rules of having a one-page resume, but it's called a nested resume because you have the resume with the addendum in the same document, which gives you the benefit of all the keywords. Okay, next. This is also direct, and I'll let you read it. With surveys averaging 9.2 satisfaction on a 10-point scale. There's another way to pull in some of those metrics that you wouldn't necessarily think about right away. And P.S., these are not the only things. This may get you sort of thinking, and do feel free to, you don't have to copy this. Add some stuff for yourself. All right, so seemingly stray components come together to tell a story. Again, it's serving the purpose of the applicant tracking system. It's serving the purpose of the person who's going to read it. By the way, they may never read the entire thing. This has happened many times. Well, they kept asking me questions that were already answered in my resume. Well, I'm sorry about that. They didn't have time to read it. Be gracious, for heaven's sakes. Answer the questions, and and by the way, having written the resume prepared you to be able to answer it. So many times, I had one guy at one of the big tech firms. He was in the C-suite. He said, "Jared, you made me an interviewing machine. All those damn questions you asked me. You made me an interviewing machine." And so, of course, he was on his way to New York and all that. All right, any questions at this point? Yes? I just need to have more of my Fitbit. So in fact, if you have a Fitbit, just walk around.
What if you do some sort of development, then you take a year off, but then you come back? How do you not have to list out, oh, well, this year I did it, then I came back this year, 2 years later? It gets really messy looking.
Yeah. The question was, what if I did development 1 year, took some time off, came back and did development again? Well, you have to put that authentically under the experience section and for real and all of that, but that's where the executive summary comes in. Because if you look at the executive summary as the aggregate of your entire career, let me try to give you a demonstration, or an example. So, I wrote for a medical device developer, and over the course of, since 2000, she was on the science side. She had developed 8 medical devices, sort of it was the same sort of illness, but it was different devices. And that brought in billions and billions and billions of dollars. But it was splintered out over all these years and over 2 different companies. What we did at the top is we said, medical device development on 11 devices, yielding. And actually, the number was so high we didn't put the number in revenue, but it was so many billions. What you could do is say total involvement in development of 3 years, writing 50 grants altogether, grant proposals, of which 52% were awarded. So you're still segmenting them out, but you're flying that up to the top. And what will happen is if you do that, you're going to have a whole story. There's your whole sort of body of work, so to speak. Does that help? Yes.
So what if you're a bad record keeper and you can't remember exact numbers? Is it okay to guesstimate or kind of ballpark?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and I get it all the time because I had people going back 25 years and they're like, I don't remember. I say, well, what does your instinct tell you? What is a safe guess? And they're like, it was probably around 25. I say, okay, let's say 25. But it may have been 50. Well, go with this, and you want to be obviously as true as possible, as sure as you can. And by the way, it's great that you're hearing this now, because use Evernote to keep track of all these little doodads, and then you'll always have it. Any other questions? All right. I love Evernote, and they should pay me. All right, there is a solution to those missing categories from your CV. So here we've restricted ourselves to what? The headline and the subheadline, education, experience, early positions. Well, here's the solution, as I already mentioned, that resume addendum. You'll see here that the resume addendum, and it may be hard to read, but awards and recognition, leadership appointments and memberships, publications, speaking engagements, recent conferences. Now, you still have to use your best judgment. If picking daisies was part of what you do and they don't want you to pick daisies, don't put it on there, obviously. Okay, you're going to get these slides and you're going to see that instead of the word month somewhere in here, I typed in Monty and then I copied it 5 times. I'm sorry about that. All right, so are there questions? We focused on career change bullet points. The hallmark of the career change resume. The executive summary can also play that big role. The resumestudio.com/samples/HTML will get you to those. It's a palette of, I think, 12 different samples. And as I said, feel free to borrow liberally. I have some ideas that I wanted to give to you in terms of job titles and areas that might be interesting. And let me just look at my phone. All right, so I'm just going to not linger on this. So there are a lot of sort of interesting things that outside of university administration may be transferable when you're coming from a humanities background. Some resources. So, yeah, you'll have this to look at. I want to talk about LinkedIn for a moment. And this is where I wish I had an interactive sort of computer up there, and I guess I could, but I didn't prepare it. When you go on LinkedIn, if you're not on it, get on it. Go to my profile. It's linkedin.com/in/Jared Reddick. And there are 2 global webinars I did in last year, maybe the year before, for the CFA Institute. One is about preparing your profile, and it's an hour long, and you'll get to hear me drone on and on and on. And by the way, I'm a lot more boring because I'm talking to certified financial advisors. So I'm like, and then Jim. But then there's also how to write for it, and it gives a whole bunch of ideas about how to use LinkedIn as a tool and how to build your profile. There are also a lot of little things like, as I said when I started, when you reach out to me to connect, I always say, are you sure? Because it's going to tell everybody that I'm an executive resume writer and out your job search. But I bring it up here because you can use it for some of your research in creative ways. Let's say you type in a keyword, some of those keywords you have identified in your job description analysis. Just see what comes up. Just go into that job search bar and see what pops up. Also, look at it outside of LinkedIn. But when you go into LinkedIn, for instance, I did this. I typed in humanities. I typed in PhD, humanities, and I forget exactly what happened, but up comes this person, and it showed sort of where she started, and it showed her career track and where she is now. And when the question is, what do I do? Sometimes if you reverse engineer where somebody 10 years ago might have been as well, and sort of look at that, it's really, really helpful. So using LinkedIn as a source of research can help. Also, when you're looking at people to connect with, click on UC Berkeley or UC whatever your school is, and it will show you all of the alum that have also connected. And that's a great way to say, hey, I'm going to expand my, this is, by the way, after you get your LinkedIn profile up and beautiful, because you want them to know who you are. When they click, they're like, wow, he or she looks really interesting, and I think I might want to hire them. So that gives you a sense of that. Also, click on companies where you've worked before. There's all sorts of this endless spider web with LinkedIn, and you all know how to research much better than I, so use it. Absolutely use it. Let's see what's next. We're almost done with the talking part. Oh, some articles that I found that were really super helpful, and I'll just let you have it. Which one? I want to say the Columbia one and the Atlantic one had a lot of really, if you've not seen those articles already, a lot of really interesting links inside of them. Okay, if you're writing your own copy, edit standing up. If you're lost in thought, step away and storyboard. I always say write now, edit later, because if you're trying to write, you know this probably, and you're trying to edit at the same time, a lot of times the creativity is stifled. Use Evernote to capture your ideas. If you're not familiar with it, basically you can sync everything to the cloud across all your devices and always have it at your fingertips. Remember purpose, content, and design. And finally, and I hope I don't get daggers for this, but learn the language of business. I'll tell you, when I moved to New York and I was thinking I was going to be at Broadway or something, I certainly didn't know the language of business. I had run a nonprofit for 5 years. By some miracle. I had gotten major funding for my little program, just because, I'm a good schmoozer, perhaps, but I didn't certainly know the language of business, and I mean, even the nonprofit world. And when I sort of was pressed into that role that I didn't anticipate, it took me those 6 months when I was getting sort of black documents back from the partner, thank God she was a good writer, and sort of just really listening to what the language was where I was going, and I thought, they're saying the same thing, and there are some really, actually, principles I need to learn anyway, just in a different way. All right, are there any questions? Yes?
So, I think I'll be okay. I'll sing out, Louise.
All right, sing out.
So, 2 questions. In one of the slides earlier, when you were doing the different job titles, it said, remember the 80-20 rule?
Oh.
What's the 80-20 rule?
Okay, good. The 80-20 rule basically applies to everything. 80% of your outcome is often going to come from 20% of the effort. Spend 80% of your time in a job search doing networking. You still need to have a great resume. And 20%, maybe even 15%, sort of following what we traditionally think of as Monster and all this sort of stuff. If you remember the slides earlier, 70% of jobs are found through networking. So she's using it. I may have an old-fashioned, I need to update my numbers, but that's what that's about. What was it? There are so many ways it can be applied, but that's what I was thinking about then. Yes, the question back here. Yes.
I'm so sorry that I don't get the joke. What do you mean edit standing up? Writing your own copy, edit standing up. As in you get tired and you quit earlier?
So when you're writing your own copy, I actually shouldn't say edit standing up. I should say write standing up. I don't know. I'm going to delete that line now that you say it. It said something else, and I edited it the other day, which was a very silly thing. Thanks for calling me out. No, that's actually quite good, and I can't defend that.
So, okay.
Next question? Yes?
I'm in the music field as well, and is the CV resume, is resume a good place to put like how do you know that you have something on SoundCloud or like music samples somewhere else? Do you put the icon on your resume? I mean, how do you work that into your...
Yeah, so links in the resume, basically?
Basically, yeah. I mean, like I have LinkedIn, but like how do you...
Yeah, so you can embed a link into the resume, absolutely. Sometimes people really, really like to have an image And so if there's a SoundCloud logo or something like that, you could do it. But when they look at it, they might not know immediately that it's a link. So like you can say profile and then embed the link into that word. The only thing I would do is turn the font black, not let it stay blue. There was another question. Yes?
Yeah, so it's a cool question.
Okay.
And this is more going back to how to convert particular information from the CV to a resume. I'm sure many people here are on fellowships or have fellowships where you're not actually allowed to work or hold a job at the same time. And it's something that looks really impressive in academia to say, I got this fellowship for 2 years, but how do you sort of translate that into a resume when you're like not actually, when the work that you're doing is doing classes or writing on your dissertation? So you're not actually allowed to work
the question is when you're not working you're sort of not working in a traditional way, but you're doing a fellowship or something where you're not being paid, you can go ahead and list that in the experience section. As you move along, it will have less importance, and then it will fall under the education section. Yes?
Would it be worth it if we quantify like that fellowship? I mean, I know
Yes, she said, would it be worth it to quantify the fellowship? Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Yes?
I have a question. Would like to hear your perspective. And thank you.
I just want to hear your perspectives, and I noticed in the slides of job titles and areas, you put the last one is about multicultural affairs and students affairs consulting, because I'm in education studies. So I feel education itself is the industry itself and also academia, and I feel I'm doing the same thing at the same time. I'm doing like for international students and student affairs, but also I'm taking classes on these two jobs help me have better understanding of each other. But in terms of prepare my CV and resume, so how will you see like which one I will like focus more, or how will you see the relationship between each other?
Because you might be going to different directions?
Yes, concerning about that.
Yes, okay, that's a very good question. Okay, so what you would do in that instance is if you have sort of one interest here and another interest there, and they both qualify, what I will sometimes do is create what I call a library of bullet points that I have in a separate document. And then I'll say, what are the 5 bullet points I want to stick into the one that I'm sending to this group? So I would just take out the one that's not relevant and put in the one that is. Does that make sense? Okay, and talk to me about that afterward if it doesn't answer it entirely. Yeah, yes?
Following up on that, I'm curious, if you're doing work that is, that relates to your research, right, but it's not your research, like let's say you're doing research in comparative literature, right, that's your PhD, and then you're working outside in philanthropy or something like that, right? But the philanthropy can speak to potentially a future research interest, right? Without appearing like a dilettante, I suppose, like that's the challenge, right? Like, yeah, you know, I had this fellowship, but at the same time I was doing this research in philanthropy, writing, reading, whatever it is, working at a nonprofit or whatever. And I was working on it and I was writing about it, you know, and so it was outside, but I don't want to seem like I was doing too much, right? And I think that's part of this fear that I have, is like, oh shit, I wasn't doing too much yet, thus not enough.
Right.
You know?
Right. Well, you're working on a PhD, you're doing too much. So what I would do is I would, if there is no break in the chronology, first of all, I would use years, not months, to present that time. But then I would put, under the experience section, I would put the work itself, and then I would create that resume addendum and put the research in a bucket. You might want to then, in the resume, reference and say, see, you could say, see the resume addendum for additional sort of activities, research activities. Does that help? Okay. Yes?
I sort of have a related question. So oftentimes the employment of grad students will be very broken up. And so you'll do a quarter of this, a quarter of that, and it may fluctuate between doing research positions, doing a TA, teaching your own class. And so I guess my question is more about how do you authentically represent that like sort of massive changes in a sense of your employment, but that it still is very continuous and there still is sort of like a line throughout.
Right. So that's where, if you look at what was happening during that time and what you were doing, is there a common thread? Is there a common theme? And then can you, like, is there a bucket with two sides, and then you can put them in there and then narrate that story? Is it possible to do that?
Yeah, I think more, I'm thinking about like how you actually represent the work history. Because at some point you're sort of,
oh yeah,
you know, and some of those, and sometimes it's like you're constantly switching.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, good. So this is brilliant. So that often happens. Let's say I have I just did a resume for a chief technology officer who had gone in, and basically he looked like a job hopper because he had so many different jobs lined up. So what you'll do in that, I hope you can you hear me? Okay. Enough of that. Okay, so you're going to create some headers that are unusual. Let's say we're to the executive summary is up here. This is going to be your sort of experience section. That's typically what you would have. You would have experience and then all of these things down here. Instead of that, create a header, and let's say it's 2011 to present. And you would put, what would be an example of what you're doing? It might feel helter-skelter.
Well, you have research positions,
yeah,
and you have teaching positions, and the research positions may be varied. Some may be more administrative, some may be more research-oriented.
Okay. Academic assignments, you would put institution name, your job title, the month to year, a description, maybe a couple of bullets. Then, institution name, job title, month to year, a description of that, and maybe a couple of bullets. So what you're doing is you're forcing a category under which it shows this big span of time, and then under it, you basically have projects. So then you say, and let's say maybe there are 5 actually here. You take the next part, and you give it a header that's true to it, and then you say 2007 to 2011, and you go with the same approach. That is not easy to do, but it works. What I did with this CTO was, he really was a turnaround CTO, as it turned out. He was hired by the founder to come in and fix the place, and then, over some period of the contract, 18 months or 2.5 years, get it done, and he would hand it back off. So we created this idea over the period of 8 years. We showed the jobs under here, and we actually put a note that said, handed company back to the founder, per plan, or whatever it was. And we bolded that so that when anybody looking at it knew that he wasn't just job hopping randomly, even though maybe he actually was. Yes?
I have a question. Most of my graduate research positions have been on large grants where I've actually not done much.
Yeah.
But there are large outcomes for the grant.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Okay, so think of the Rolling Stones. They're going to go on tour, right? And they need their fleet of 5 buses painted, and you're a painter. Okay, so you are part of a 6-member painting crew that over a period of, let's say, 6 weeks, painted this fleet of 5 buses. Then the touring company of 50 went on and did a 30-city tour. which was attended by a jillion people, which made up $1 jillion. Does that make sense? It totally works, yeah. Because you were, I mean, it's, Yes? Anybody else? All right. So this is where I wanted to go into some, are there truly no more questions? Because I feel like we need to stretch for a minute. Stand up, stretch. Let's do 5 minutes. We'll come back in 5 minutes. All right. So I want to pick up where we left off. There were some interesting questions about, there was an interesting question about using this format. If you've done, there were 3 things. There was GSR, stands for something research, I'm assuming. Forgive me. By the way, the editing standing up is basically if you're tired, if you're, I'm going to fix that. I just can't get over it. Okay, so and then there's TAing, and then there is teaching, right? I think it was. So the concept, the question was, how do you make that happen in this sort of a structure? So I'm just going to pick up there if you don't mind. I would put the GSR work here, and I would actually maybe spell it out, because some of us might not know what it is, and also maybe an applicant tracking system may be looking for the actual word. Then I would put the summary of time under which that happened. Then I would put the titles, what this is again is the institution name, the job title. This is the discrete number of months and years that that specific position happened. A little scope of work, and then a couple of bullet points. And yes, you would go ahead and bucket these. Yes?
If the technical name for what you do is really arcane, is it possible to change it?
It is.
So instead of saying like graduate research assistant, could someone say, research assistant or independent researcher, depending on the type of job? Or how much leeway do you have?
Well, most people, I don't think that's such an archaic sort of term.
Graduate research assistant? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it is. You would want to make sure, because you can't use that as a keyword necessarily, but you would want to make sure and put keywords elsewhere. That's one of the things about these bullet points that are bucketed, is you can choose those keywords and put them in and make sure they are filled in. The question I had earlier also is, how do you make your classroom management look like project management? That's kind of a stretch, and I need to think about that. It is project management.
Especially when you're designing, I'm serious, when you're designing your own courses,
yeah.
That's more than just, getting up in front of students and facilitating conversation.
Yeah. Really what you're trying to do is you're trying to have them see you through their lens. So you could, if you, I thought about that a little bit more, you could say classroom and project management. It's a bit of a stretch. But then you need to also be able to say, well, heck, I got to get through your applicant tracking system, people. What do you expect? And I wanted to go back to this for just a moment, if I can. The GSR thing up here, this may be a little helter-skelter. Like, you may have had this, and this, then this, and that. You know what I mean? I would still put whatever, you could still say, and you have to make it work for you. You could still say 2011 to present, but what you're doing is you're starting to get into what's called a functional resume, but you're making it behave like a chronological, not strictly chronological. But you're saying, here is this up here, and then by the TA and the teaching stuff down here, you're going to put them in here. So what you've done is you've taken the impossible and made it easier to read for the reader. Yes?
So I have a question that's a little bit complicated, and forgive me if it's difficult to hear, but I think you've given us some of the most practical tools to turn what we do as graduate students into something that's legible by people who probably will look at a PhD and go, I don't know what you've been doing for the past 7 years. But I guess I want to ask, this is one of the reactions a potential employer might have. You've been in school for 7 years, so you haven't been working. So, and you've articulated some of the things, like, for instance, event planning, some of the hard skills where I can say, that looks like work. I recognize that that is work. And I think the dissertation doesn't always get onto the resume, but has so much work in it that all of us, when we finish, want to value and don't want to let go of. And if that's just something we have to leave off, for instance, I can think of describing a dissertation or describing teaching in this sort of work language, but having someone being like, okay, so you wrote a dissertation, I don't really need to hear about how that relates to work, but a dissertation as a long-term project has project management, has the ability to receive funds, to travel, to collaborate with people. And I guess I'm just asking you, realistically, when we go and make these resumes, how much we just have to sort of say, okay, they're going to think I haven't been working for 7 years, or the dissertation doesn't count as work, I can't talk about it as work. I think that's one of the questions the connections we're trying to make is how much of what we do in grad school is already work, and because it feels like work. So anyways, I just think I recognize from the side you're coming from and really appreciate it, having you to sort of go between, but I just wanted to air that because I think we all feel it.
So let me see what I can do to answer this. And sometimes the solutions I have for people are when I'm on a trail at Mount Tamalpais, because they give me hard questions like that. Maybe I'll do this, because I have an idea. Okay. So let's talk about the executive summary for a minute. Because you can take the same bucketed ideas into the executive summary. So here's your name, contact information. Executive summary could be 3 lines. And then core skills, bullet, bullet, bullet. Writing and editing, that becomes your bucket. And this is going to fly everything that matters to you into this bucket. And you can say, authored 8 major papers over 7 years, published by XYZ, period, includes dissertation, or includes 50-page dissertation, 1,000-page dissertation. Clearly, I'm out of my depth here. I'm just gonna go here. Okay. So the includes is where you could highlight that, and then you could say see addendum, and then the addendum is that resume addendum is where you could list all of that. And then what you also might do, all this laughing, we should open up the back windows. It's getting a little hot up in here. Okay, so do 3 at least, and no more than 5. And then these are going to be, again, these are your core skills. They may never ask for the writing and editing, but when they see it, they may be like, oh yeah, we could totally use that. Now the question is, I've written for a lot of academics, and there's an academic way of writing, and I often have to rewrite their stuff for them, so.
That's being phased out.
What's that?
That kind of writing is being phased out.
Oh, is it? Okay, good. Yeah, these are definitely, she said that kind of writing is being phased out. These are definitely people in their late 40s and beyond. I'm like, really, get to the point. So, does that help answer that question? And then what would happen here is you would have then your experience section and all the chronology down here.
But that doesn't hurt. I mean, that doesn't sort of, it's okay to have it.
It is okay to have it.
Hold on to what we did while we were in school.
Well, you know what I might do, and I did this a little wrong. I would put this as the 3rd bullet, and I put 2 more relevant ones up top. I hope I don't say anything offensive. But then I would also list the dissertation under your education, because it's expected you would list the title and all of the sort of details that go with it.
Oh, so how
with your education. Because if you have a PhD, the assumption is you had one.
And that's like 3 bullets, like you describe it?
No. You would just say, the PhD in what, at what school, and for a while you can put the GPA, if it's a good GPA, and then you would put, maybe in the line underneath it, in italics, dissertation, colon, and then the title, as long as it fits on one line. That's all I'm going to say about that. Okay. I feel like Carol Burnett is what I feel like. Okay. Now, are there other questions? Okay. Let's talk about what goes into, if you don't mind, an executive summary. There are a couple of ways to start an executive summary. And I'm going to use a word because it's just popping to mind, but I would never use it anymore because it's sort of overused. Oh. This is really hideous, but I'm just giving you the idea. That's the dumbest thing I've ever written in my life. Okay, what I've done here is really badly and poorly obviously demonstrated that this is who you are. This is sort of you at your essence that you bring to the table. And then what you are at a very high level, instructor, event planner, and something else, offering 10 years experience across what, and what else. So, and what happens is some of these become customizable depending on who the audience is, because you might offer 10 years experience across a larger set, but actually you could say 10 years experience focused on, and then you pull that smaller sort of subset down, and that becomes, when you send it out to Joe, it says 3 things. When you send it to Jane, it says 3 other things, or some mix. So, I'm not going to talk about the team and budget management, although that's sort of the hallmark of what I do all the time with execs. But this is also a place where you would say, if you ever get to that point, management experience of 2 to 20 member teams. When you get bigger, more, you might say a 5,000 member workforce, that sort of thing, and budgets up to whatever that largest number is. There's also something that you're going to see when you get the slides, and that is 2 terms. The ranging, oops, my gosh, ranging and up to. Okay, so you see that all the time when you go, markdowns of as much as 80%. Like, really? So, if you've managed a team of 2, you've managed a team of 3, and then somewhere along the way you've managed a team of 15. You can say a team of up to 15. The other thing you could do is say managing teams of 2 to 15. Both of those things tell a story. The story that's being told here is, I want to manage a team that size, and I'm capable. By the way, managing people really is awful. Just saying. But if you want to do it, that's how you do it. So it's really sort of, when they interpret it, they're going to say, oh, they want to be a manager. Here, they're like, I can manage small and, semi-small teams here. But they have some sort of management experience. You could also be, clarify and say, up to 2 and 10, up to 2 direct and 10 indirect reports. So that, again, clarifies that a little bit more, that says, this is the reporting relationship and the expertise I bring to the table. And by the way, when you're managing people, especially direct, it's, you have all sorts of HR things to be concerned about and all sorts of legal issues that you have to be concerned about. So I wouldn't be jumping on to managing large teams anytime soon without some sort of expertise. The same, another thing that they like is the size of the institutions for which you've worked. So you could say, let's say that the smallest organization you've worked for was the San Francisco Boys Chorus, this $600,000 budget. And then the largest was Apple. Who even knows? 175 billion. That's just a silly example. So, doing X, Y, and Z on behalf of institutions with revenues ranging 600,000 to 2,000 billion. So you're showing a range. You can also say, if you want to go the Apple route, you could say, doing X, Y, and Z on behalf of institutions or companies, organizations, with revenues up to. So you're not then calling out the smaller budget numbers or revenue numbers. So that's one way to play with language to your advantage. Yes?
I just want to have to weigh in here, I'm sorry. We have about 10 more, we can be in the room for about 15, 20 more minutes. So maybe spend another 10 minutes worth of questions, and I know David Goldberg would like to say a few words.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do 10. Let's set the timer. Oh, you got it? Okay, good. So are there questions that have emerged since we talked here? Or questions that, okay. One of the, yes?
Oh, well, have you seen people from the humanities have interesting career trajectories?
Myself? I plead the fifth. No. I did a lot of research for this presentation, and there are plenty on LinkedIn. Yes, a lot of people who I write for who are from academia are in the sciences. Yes?
I asked earlier presenter this question, and I'd like to ask you too. Cover letters. Do you work with cover letters at all?
I do, and I hate them.
So I read maybe 80 resumes a year on average, not very many, but I always hate the way that they start. It's always like, I think I would be an ideal candidate for your job.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I find that annoying. What? Which might be my problem. But, what is do you think is a strong opener for our cover letter?
That's a good question. So you are not alone in the whole hating cover letters and reading them and they all read the same. So when you find one, when I was still in New York, there were 2 cover letters that I thought were so well written, probably by somebody like me as it turns out, but I took them with me and I read them over dinner and I kept them and I read them again and again and I called that person because it was such a true letter. It wasn't the whole stuff you would see in a resume, what they call it, panel book or whatever it's called, with all those samples. The other thing about a cover letter is it feels cheesy sometimes, if you're not careful. So I tend to, and I get flack about this all the time, but I don't care. I tend to say, I'm writing to express my interest in XYZ position, posted online at blah blah blah.com. And I'll put the XYZ position in bold, italicize it sometimes, and then, but not the place where I found it. The reason I do that is because the person who's organizing the letters can easily say, oh, if it gets lost on the floor or something like that, they can easily sort of put it back together. It also gives them a chance to say, how well is our advertising working for this job? And then you go into, with 5 years experience in X, Y, and Z, blah, 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 I'm particularly interested in the posting because. And sort of let them know why you're interested in it. Let them know right out of the gate that you're interested in your writing specifically to them. And yeah, I'm the ideal candidate, all that stuff. It's been used a lot. Sometimes if you have to sort of keep it formal and sort of follow, at the end, for instance, my resume is enclosed, and I look forward to it, having an opportunity to meet with you, that sort of thing. But in the middle, if you can truly write from the heart and write well and write substantive, sort of not flowers, but definitely something that's going to be interesting to them, especially if you think, you know what, I can solve a problem for you. You could have that cover letter just be 4 paragraphs. The other thing you can do with a cover letter is have a formal opening and then a set of bullet points. Then I'm particularly interested, or company name is particularly interesting to me because, and then you narrate, and then you close it with an official close. Those bullet points allow you to address, mix and match some of the things that seem to be high-level problems or questions or needs for the company or institution. And that isn't always apparent in the job description. You might have to do some research on the company, read their press, sort of read between the lines. And it may only be 3 bullet points, but it breaks up the page a little bit. You can also do the, remember when I was talking about your question about how to do the dissertation, and I said in the executive summary you can have these 3 bullet points? You can do that same thing in a cover letter, 3 bullet points, with the same bolding bucket with the description. And that's where you could put the writing and editing, especially if it's not, in addition to what you've posted and that I'm a fit for, I also offer. That actually might be the best place for that. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely.
Okay. I think we're winding down. One more question? Yes.
So, it's kind of going along with this idea. So if you have, I'll give you an example for me. So I'm right now studying religious studies and philosophy, but one of the career things I want to get into eventually is veterinary science. And I know that there are some cases where doing religion or philosophy with ethics and things may kind of appeal, but has some type of it may help that you can kind of do it. So would the cover letter be, I feel like the company may not necessarily care about that whole philosophy thing, but I want to offer it as something that may be useful. Would the cover letter be the place to kind of justify why I put that stuff on the resume?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. Yes, and what you've got to do, the sort of more it doesn't make sense, the more creative, and the onus is on you to figure out how you're going to say it. And think of also front-loading important information, especially if it's interesting, and then if you can back it up. Because if you front-load it and keep their information and their attention, then chances are they'll read it. You can also integrate that into LinkedIn somehow. Say interests include the intersection between such and such, blah, 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 blah. And then when they cross-reference LinkedIn, because they will, then they even get more of that sort of brand that you're bringing along. Yes?
In terms of the resume, I've gotten conflicting advice. Sometimes we all have rather quirky extracurricular things we like to do.
Yeah.
And I've been told sometimes, always include that because you never know who might also be interested in the quirky whatever you do. And then other people have said, no, absolutely not, because that's information.
That's right. So the question is basically hobbies, or things that you like to do that are sort of outside or extracurricular. The more far out, and the more sort of you're trying to align, you might just leave some of if there's anything that's really far out. But such that there are things that are going to create affinity with someone else, I would definitely include them, but not in the resume. I like to write LinkedIn profiles, the summary, from, I this, I that, as long as it's not I am so fabulous. But you're telling a story in first person. At the end, and this wouldn't apply for you, but I say outside the office, I can usually be found on a trail, blah, 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 blah. So I'll sort of share that as a last statement on the LinkedIn summary. Outside of my grueling PhD program, I'm usually found sleeping. I think, do we have time for one more? Okay.
My question is that a lot of these job applications will say something like 5 to 7 years experience is what they're looking for.
Right.
And if I sort of go by my resume the way you've written it, I'm like, I totally have 10 years of experience, even though I've been high school 10 years,
yes,
whatever, and I've never had a job or something.
Right.
But all these types of experiences, is it okay to, I'm trying to figure out just how qualified I am to apply to certain things.
Yeah. So one of the examples you'll see in the slides is 10 years of professional and academic experience, including this subset and that subset. That's probably the way to handle it. If they're saying 5 to 7, that could be a wish list, or that could be, that's the entry point. The fact is you don't know. But what this comes back to is spend 15% on that and 85% on your network, what was being said earlier, because that's the thing that's really, what we're doing with the job descriptions, we've been talking a lot about that at the analysis, we're using that as research tool. to create the document. That doesn't mean we ever have to apply for a single one of those actual jobs.
I just want to thank Jared. Let's give him a big round of applause. This is